The Assad family dominated Syria for 5 decades. The Syrian public, I think, for the most part, are overjoyed. I don't think there will be many people who will be shedding any tears. A lot of these rulings are symbolic in nature. Bashar Al Assad and Bashar Al Assad are, of course, in Russia. It's really unlikely that they will ever be extradited to Syria. The way in which Vladimir Putin operates, he would not like to see another case of a dictator who he personally backed being sentenced to death. The Assad family dominated Syria for 5 decades. His father, Hafiz Al Assad, came to power in 1971. He was a ruthless dictator who established an authoritarian regime that was able to become dynastic. His second son, Bashar, succeeded him, and you saw a situation of one-party rule. There was no public criticism of the regime allowed. Where there were elections, you saw, figures in the excess of, 90%, 95% in favor of the president. This was a regime that really survived on fear, on arresting any potential opposition. People were disappeared. And this was all, of course, before what happened in 2011 with the Arab Spring, as it was called. You saw various regimes, starting with Tunisia, where dictators were toppled. And the expectation in Syria was, could this happen to Bashar al Assad? Could this be something that brings his demise as well? So you saw the start of protests in Syria. But unlike in Tunisia, the brutality of the Assad regime's response under Bashar al-Assad was severe. This then really saw the spread across Syria of protests, which certainly in those early months were united and largely peaceful. But eventually it all, unfortunately, became more of a civil war, an armed conflict. But of course, with a regime heavily militarized, with backing from Putin's Russia, from Iran, that was using its air power, its artillery, to hit its opponents very hard, destroying large parts of key cities such as Homs, Aleppo, Damascus itself. You saw a situation in which, when the armed opposition in the northwest made a move at the back end of 2024, the Assad regime was no longer able to push it back. It had lost that external backing. It had lost the sort of loyalty of key components of Syrian society that had kept it in place. And amazingly, it fell very quickly. Its demise was rapid. And this brought about an extraordinary situation in December 2024, where Syrians, so many of whom, millions of whom, were displaced and become refugees, would watch the scenes in Damascus, in Aleppo, in Homs, these key Syrian cities, as that regime that has so dominated and scarred Syrian society for so long fell apart. And we now look at a situation 20 months on, with court cases going ahead against some of the linchpins of that regime, including, of course, the former president and his brother Bashar Al Assad, who were so instrumental in orchestrating the horrors and the atrocities that regime was responsible for. The Syrian public, I think, for the most part, are overjoyed. That's what you see outside of the courthouse, where you've seen families of victims holding up their images. I don't think there will be many people who will be shedding any tears for any of the Assad family who are involved. But there will be one, of course, very big regret that a lot of these rulings are symbolic in nature, very important. But Bashar al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad are, of course, in Russia. They've been given asylum by the Putin regime, and it's really unlikely that they will ever be extradited to Syria to face justice. So that will be one regret. But I think emotionally it is going to be very significant for Syrians. But it has to be a part of a process. And that process, I think, also has to see greater safeguards going on in future so that none of these verdicts and trials can be challenged, that everybody understands that proper due process has been carried out. There's been a massive demand amongst Syrians for transitional justice, to hold these people accountable for the hundreds of thousands of people who were killed, disappeared, tortured to death, for the children that were killed. And this has created a great deal of domestic pressure. So what we have seen is a court case that started in April against 9 figures, 8 of whom are tried in absentia, only 1 tried in person, Atif Najib, who was brought into the court in Damascus in his prison gear, in his prison pajamas. And you are looking at a case where I think that, that justice system is being tested to the nth degree. And whilst I think there will be very few Syrians who will question the verdict that these people are certainly guilty of huge crimes against humanity that they've perpetrated, there is a challenge going forward, because you've got to demonstrate that any new authorities in Syria are for the rule of law. You've got to have a proper legal system. And this court case has taken place in advance of much of that legal system being rebuilt in a proper fashion. It's been based on international law, the 4th Geneva Convention, and a whole load of bits of customary international law. But a transitional justice law is coming into effect as well. So going forward, of course, there are going to be many others that Syrians will expect to be tried. But on what basis? It then brings questions of truth and reconciliation. How far do you go? How far down the chain of command do you examine? Because at some point, you've got to draw a line under it. The Russian authorities will be very reluctant to go back on their word. They gave Bashar Al Assad and his family asylum, and the way in which Vladimir Putin operates, he would not like to see another case of a dictator who he personally backed, including with military force, with economic help, with diplomatic assistance, being sentenced to death, being executed within Syria. So this is not something that he would like to see. There may be some who think that perhaps that Bashar al-Assad will meet a very Russian sort of end, that he will be knocked off in some clandestine way. But who knows? It's just not likely he is going to be extradited, nor is it likely that Bashar al-Assad is going to risk being arrested by leaving Russia. There are some now who argue, though, that with the passing of a death sentence, it makes it harder for certain countries also to extradite Bashar al-Assad or Maher, his brother, to Syria, because they have prohibitions, including the United Kingdom, against extraditions to countries that will pass a death sentence. So, unfortunately, it's not going to be a case of seeing real justice being served on these Assads. And even worse, they're probably living in luxury with all their ill-gotten gains and billions that they have stolen from Syria. And that will leave a very, very bitter aftertaste to Syrians and all the victims of that regime. These sorts of regimes prepare for the days of their demise. They squirrel their funds into offshore accounts, into other jurisdictions, and we're looking at billions, not millions, of Syrian funds that were taken, and it will be extremely difficult to get hands on that. They know exactly what they were doing, and other regimes have done it in the past as well. So as much as they will try, I fear it's not going to be a successful path. But what there will be, I think, further attempts to get other persons who are accused of such crimes extradited to Syria. We've seen in Lebanon a very senior general who is part of the Assad regime has been arrested with possible extradition to Syria. That's not happened before. We may see other examples of this. We may see sums being returned to Syria, but for the large part, I think it's very, very unlikely that that's going to happen. I have always believed that having proper judicial paths to holding parties to account is vital. I think it was regrettable, for example, that Gaddafi, the former Libyan dictator and leader, was killed in the way that he was because he didn't get to court. And being in court is very important for the victims, that they can narrate their own story, their suffering. It's part of their recovery. Well, the new Syrian government, of course, it was formed out of those fighters largely that came down from Idlib in the northwest of Syria, had a huge challenge because you essentially saw with the demise of the regime a collapse of at least part of the state of Syria, that is the governance, the administration of Syria, and they had to get that up and running as quickly as possible. You saw, for example, in those early weeks, a rapid decline in the amount of electricity available to Syrians. It was going down to 1 hour a day, 2 hours a day in Damascus in those early months. So it was really challenging. And then you had, of course, a security control. How do you control the security of the country? Make sure that there weren't revenge killings and looting and the like. So they had to establish that sort of order. I think what we have seen, particularly in the first year to 18 months, is that the new authorities have established international legitimacy. But right now, the greatest challenge today in Syria, and I was there for much of July, when you talk to Syrians, is the economy. The economy is paralyzed. Inflation is running rampant. Electricity costs are going up and up. Transport costs as well. And simply, it's really tough on ordinary Syrians, even middle-class Syrians, to earn enough money to feed their families, to go forward.